Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, guys. Again, hey, stay consistent, right? So for this video, we are going to finish off our nation-state lecture and talk about the early industrial revolution. You say you want a revolution. So we talked about Hobbes, we talked about Locke. There we go. We talked about Hobbes, we talked about Locke in the last lecture. We talked about de Cive, Hobbes' view on man in the natural state. We talked about Leviathan, his ideas with respect to the social contract, human nature is selfish. We talked about Locke. We talked about his two treatises on government, man in the natural state, social contract, his version of property. And then we talked about Rousseau, the discourse on inequality, and then the social contract. Talked about, again, human nature. What are the roots of inequality? We talked about what property is, at least according to Rousseau. And then we finished up talking about this idea of popular sovereignty and the general will versus the government. So now, click the slideshow from current slide. There we go. We're going to talk about the early industrial revolution, 1750 to 1870. We're going to talk about the preconditions to an industrial revolution, like what elements were there to have an industrial revolution start, and then we'll talk about the new technologies and new power. I'm better in that corner. All right, so we can trace the origins of the Industrial Revolution to Great Britain. Now, why Great Britain instead of other areas in the continent, France or Spain, for example, or even Asia? Well, Great Britain had the political stability after the Glorious Revolution in 1688 that we talked about, where Mary and William were invited in by Parliament and James GTFO'd to the continent. And Great Britain was also successful in wars against France. The 7 Years' War, for example, 1756 to 1763, from which France had to recover from economically and politically. So that's why it didn't happen on the continent. Now you'd think, well, what about Asia? China, it's relatively stable. Well, the dynasty in China, the Qing dynasty, Qing, unlike Britain, it did not need increased mechanization. The Qing dynasty in China had as we will see, had an excess of labor. It had a large amount of labor, so there was no need for these labor-saving devices that Britain required. And as we will see with the Qing dynasty, well, in Britain, the British merchant class found themselves with more and more power in Parliament. And so unlike the merchants in China, unlike the merchants in Mughal India, they were not as politically connected. So the merchants in Britain had the opportunity to push for legislation that was geared towards the economic development of Britain. So let's talk about some preconditions. Let's talk about, we'll talk about resources, and then, spoiler alert, we'll talk about economics. Well, one of the resources, one of the preconditions that you need is you need markets, you need a demand. And in part due to the expansion of the British Empire into the New World, Great Britain had that market of goods, had that market for British goods, which pushed for an increasing demand. Supply and demand, I mean, that's basic economics. Increased demand leads to increased production, and increased production required an expansion from the so-called cottage industry. The cottage industry is where goods are sometimes literally made in one cottage, to a factory system where all the production of a good is within one larger factory. So this is this is a type of factories you're probably more used to. Unlike the factories I talked about with the slave trade, these factories are for manufacturing. So, I mean, we're talking cottage industry. So, for example, uh, IB might have, we'll take shoes. In IB's house, we might make the soles of the shoe. In Amber's house, we might make the laces. In Jim's house, we might make the leather to put together. And then with Tony's house, we might take all these resources and put them together to make one shoe. That's the cottage industry. The factory system is you take all those different elements and put them under one factory roof. So fairly straightforward, I believe. Another precondition to the Industrial Revolution with respect to resources is power. Because you're starting to have a more mechanized process, you need to power these mechanized devices. And to help power these new means of production, Great Britain had easy access to power. Great Britain had a lot of coal, so you burn the coal to generate the power, but it also had access to running water. Think a paddle wheel to help you turn the stone in a mill to help make rain. Power like that. But it also had, unlike the continent, it had demographic resources. Because Great Britain will experience a demographic, a population increase between 1600 and 1700, within 100 years, where the population will nearly double from 5 million in 1600 to 9 million in 1700. So you're having a big population increase. You're having a shift from rural areas to urban areas, where displaced farmers will move to cities to search for a better life or to search for a better job. And in the cities, this increased population in the cities will also lead to increased demand for food. You've got to be able to feed these people in the cities, and consumer goods in the cities. So we have needs, we have markets and demands, we have Great Britain having power, Great Britain having demographic resources. But most importantly, I would probably say, yeah, most importantly, we have economics. Because in addition to the increased power in the merchant class that are pushing for economic development, you have the development of a banking system in England to allow for investment in these new ventures. One big thing that any inventor, any person who's trying to get into business needs is investment, is capital, either through loans or through somebody literally giving you the money. One thing that allowed England to have a bit of a step up on, say, the continent was the creation of the Bank of England in 1684. We have the creation of the Bank of England, seen the front scene here. And it was founded to provide England with the necessary capital, the necessary money for expenditures, including the Army and the Navy. Now, in 1694, the Bank of England was initially incorporated, initially founded with £1.2 million by individual lenders. And what would happen is, rather than depositing your money in the bank and then the bank using that deposit for other parts, these individual lenders would buy shares in the bank and then be placed on their board of governors. It's not really a modern example, but it's an example that everybody may see every year. In the movie It's a Wonderful Life, Mr. Potter is on the board of governors for the banks in the little town. So that's the type of initial investment that the Bank of England received. What made the Bank of England important for England was it was initially the only legal bank to issue notes. That is, think a dollar bill, think a $5 bill, think a $10 bill. These are essentially IOUs, saying if you take this bill to the bank, you will be able to exchange it for an equivalent amount of gold or silver, for example. But just as importantly, the Bank of England received all the revenue coming into England via taxes, tariffs, whatever money England brought in, it would be deposited in the Bank of England. So it had the power of the government behind it. And this investment would allow the bank to extend loans for capital investment into industry. It could be providing loans for capital investment like factories. It could be capital investment into machinery. And so the creation of the Bank of England, and you might be going, well, why doesn't France have a bank? Why doesn't Spain? Well, at this point, remember, you're focused on mercantilism, this idea of hoarding gold and silver. So rather than investing in the country, the bank and any banks in Spain, if there are banks, are focused on making sure that that money stays as gold or silver. In France, there were attempts at banks, but France, shall we say, had a bad experience with banking, and that kind of turned them off of banks for another 100 years. The other thing with respect to economics is wages. I'll get to there in a second. Wages. Because wages in traditional rural industries were higher in England than in other European nations. You paid a lot more for someone who worked a loom or wove fabric, made clothes, ground grain. So there was a financial incentive to create labor-saving devices. You don't need, if you have a machine, you don't need 10 people to do a job when you could have 5. That saves you money. Increased industrialization will pull down wages and make these industries more profitable. We also have new technologies and new power, or new technologies and power. Now, most of the new technologies and power in England during the early Industrial Revolution were tied to textiles. Silk and cotton started becoming more popular than traditional English wool. So demand for these products made from these goods started taking off. If you've ever had your grandma knit you a wool sweater, you know how itchy, you know how warm that is. But compared to a cotton t-shirt, it's night and day. So silk and cotton were becoming more and more and more popular than traditional English wool. So demands for products made from silk, products made from cotton started taking off. Products coming from India in particular increased in popularity and demand. So I told you about this connection between merchants and legislatures, merchants and politicians. And so in response to the increased goods, particularly cotton goods, Parliament passed what were known as the Calico. Whee! There we go. The Calico Acts. In 1700 and 1720, Parliament will pass 2 acts called the Calico Acts, C-A-L-I-C-O. And what these acts did, boop, current slide. what these acts did was it banned the importation of cotton goods from India. It said, we will not allow any cotton goods coming from India. It did not, however, ban the importation of cotton because the desire for cotton goods continued going up. And the increased demand of cotton goods meant that English producers of cotton goods had to pick up the slack, had to figure out how to increase production to meet the growing demand. So that's why the early emphasis was on textiles. And so with the introduction of, with the banning of cotton goods from India and the increased demand, this led to the introduction of a number of inventions designed to increase production within the textile industry. And so here on the left, we have the flying shuttle. Developed in 1733, patented by John Kay. The flying shuttle allowed for the weaving of much wider fabrics and allowed for the mechanization of weaving. So you can weave a large, much wider amount of fabric much more quickly, which will allow you to then cut and shape and produce these fabrics into goods like shirts and pants and the like. On the right here, we have the spinning jenny, patented, there we go, in 1764 by James Hargreaves, Hargreaves. The spinning jenny will reduce the amount of work needed to produce yarn. So flying shuttle produces fabric, spinning jenny produces yarn, and it was designed to meet the demand created by the flying shuttle. So you have all this fabric being produced, you need a way to sew it together, you need yarn. Now going back to mercantilism for a second, the demands in the mother country for silk and cotton, for example, led to the need to secure access to these goods. This will lead to imperial powers such as Britain setting up spheres of influence. At least initially, they will set up spheres of influence before shifting to direct control over the colonies, as we will see when we talk about South Asia. So what we're going to find is we're going to find industrialization. There we go. Industrialization in the early Industrial Revolution lead countries like Britain to go to the source, find where cotton is grown, find where silk is grown. And then the increased demand leads them to initially set up a sphere of influence before taking over the area itself. Now, I do want to talk, before I end this lecture, I want to talk a little bit more about the factory system and what it would look like. This is an image of an etching of the factory system, what a factory system in the 18th century, that is the 1700s, would look like. So on the right, we have a large number of updated spinning jennies designed to more quickly create the wool, the big spools of wool. And on the right, we have a very much updated version of the flying shuttle, getting these large spools of fabric. Now, if you notice, for the most part, the people working in the factories are women. In particular, they're young women. The idea behind a factory system is that it would create a safe space for young women to go out and earn a living, at least until they're married. Once a woman became married, they would be removed, generally by their family now, removed from the factory and be expected to engage in a more familial role, a more motherly role. In these factories, the young women would often be treated in some cases like members of the family. Each shift would effectively be like sisters, with the factory owners as the paterfamilias, the father amongst all. So he would ensure that they would remain virtuous. They would be taken care of financially to a degree, as well as with respect to learning. It also helped that women uh, tended to ask and receive lower wages than men for the same type of job. The more things change, the more things they remain the same. So early on, the factory system basically was an avenue for young women to go out and engage in the world. As we get more and more and more mechanization, more and more men engage in the factory system, replacing young women, and things get a little more Dickensian. So if you've ever read any Charles Dickens, by the 19th century, it's much more children in the factories, men in the factories, men being sent away when they get hurt, and the like. All right, so this lecture, in fact, will be a shorter lecture. It will be a shorter video. There we go. Stop sharing. Hey, you can see me in all my glory. So that was basically just a sort of wrap up to talk about the Industrial Revolution, to get you guys an idea of tying it in with mercantilism, to get an idea of why they're going to the source even in the 17th, 18th, 19th centuries. They're not looking for spices anymore. They're looking for silk. They're looking for cotton. They're looking for markets. So when we're talking about colonialism, when we're talking about empire, it's very much predicated, it's very much based on this idea of mercantilism. Even in the 19th century, when they're saying, no, we're done with mercantilism, as we will see, it's very much based on some of the same ideas that are prevalent early on in the early colonial era. All right. Have enough drink. I've talked a lot today. All these lectures have been done on Monday the 11th. Do not forget that your first assignment, the annotated bibliography, is due 1 week from Thursday. That is the 21st. There is nothing that says you have to wait until the last second to do your assignment. You could, if you decide, I don't want to do the annotated bibliography now, you could by all means do the primary source assignment or the secondary source assignment. You're more than welcome to get things done early and then hand them in when they're supposed to be handed in. We have a limited amount of time. I would not sit on my hands with this. I know that you guys have other classes, so hopefully everything is well. Hopefully you survived your first week, and I will let you guys go forth and slay dragons. And I will see some of you guys on Thursday, maybe. Other than that, you will see my bright, shiny face on next Monday or next Tuesday. Talk to you guys later.